evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks so much for coming out for sort of the keynote activity of Adams State University's week-long commemoration of Martin Luther King Jr., his life, and most importantly for the important human rights, African American rights, civil rights crusade for which he gave his own life and for which many other people gave their own lives and risked beatings and incarceration and other kinds of retributions from a white society thoroughly dedicated to white supremacy. One of the things that you've just experienced, although we're pretty close, back in the heyday of the movement, not everything started exactly on time because things just sort of had to happen as they happened. Tonight, Adams State University is especially fortunate to have one of the major figures of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but also an individual whose career in human rights and support of people attaining dignity and opportunity persists right up to the present day. I have the distinct privilege of introducing Robert Paris Moses, a native of Harlem, who was inspired by Dr. King, went to work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and shortly became a member of the brand new organization in 1960, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, and was sent to Mississippi, which is an interesting place for a young man from Harlem to be sent, where he worked to register African Americans to vote in southwest Mississippi in counties of Pike County, Amite County, Walthall County, Mississippi, and then later in the Mississippi Delta. And sort of the culmination of his career included in Mississippi included being one of the leaders of the Freedom Summer Initiative in 1964, and also the initiative to desegregate the Democratic Party and advocate for inclusion of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as the real authentic delegation from Mississippi in the 1964 Democratic Party's nominating process. After his time in Mississippi, which you could think of as sort of time on the cross, Moses spent time in Tanzania teaching in schools there, teaching math. And since 1982, Bob Moses has been especially central, the organizing figure, the visionary behind what's called the Algebra Project, which seeks to make quality, access to quality mathematics education, particularly algebra, available to all Americans, not just those at the top. And this initiative particularly targets people in the lowest quartile, socioeconomic quartile, who are people who often are simply denied access and don't see themselves as capable of doing algebra and gaining access to sort of white-collar professions and full civic personhood and civic equality. So with that, I would like for you to give a warm Alamosa, Adams State, San Luis Valley, Southern Colorado welcome to Robert Paris Moses.
How you guys doing out there? They're going to turn the lights up so I can see you. Those lights. There you go. Can you do better? Got more lights? We'll wait for the lights. Yeah, want the lights. So how's everybody? Good. So that was a great introduction, and no notes. Uh, thanks so much for that. So I'm going to try and talk. I'm actually going to read a talk. How long are you willing to sit and listen?
Until you're done.
Okay, I'm going to take you up on that. I'm going to talk about the preamble to the Constitution and what it means and a way that we should think about the Constitution. So let's start by just saying the preamble. Just say it after me, okay? And while you say it, there's one thing to think about, which is what it says, but there's also to think about what it's doing. So, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. You did that well. When Kingman Brewster died, it fell to Sam Chauncey to say how Kingman should be remembered and to plan a memorable space in the Grove Street Cemetery where all presidents of Yale rest. Sam designed a low black marble wall to enclose Kingman's grave. On it he etched two sentences to illuminate how, on planet Earth, the ocean of law humans inherit, or to instruct and inform the constitutional law humans create. The presumption of innocence is not just a legal concept. In common sense terms, it rests on that generosity of spirit which assumes the best, not the worst, of a stranger. In 1749, a West African boy, 9 years old and captured, sailed the Middle Passage to Virginia and survived. In August of that year, a Scottish-born merchant slave trader peered into the pluck of that 9-year-old and bought him. Up-and-coming Charles Stewart bought personable Somerset to be his personal slave. 20 years pass. It's 1769. Stewart is 44 and Somerset is 29. Accompanies him to London to help care for Stewart's sister's family when her husband dies. London is awash with Africans from the British Empire, slaves and runaways, beggars and workers, seagoers and artisans, and Somerset running errands everywhere for his master, meeting blacks on the streets and the stores along the docks, arranges a baptism, acquires English godparents, and on October 1st, 1771, flows into London's stream of insurgent runaway slaves. Charles Stewart, feeling betrayed and publicly insulted, posted notices, and on November 2nd, slave catchers delivered Somerset to a ship bound for Jamaica. 7 days later, Somerset's godmother, Elizabeth Cade, pays to petition the Court of King's Bench for a writ of habeas corpus to release him. Lord Mansfield, the Chief Justice, issued a writ requiring Captain Knowles to explain the reason for detaining Somerset on the Anne and Mary. 6 days later, Somerset appears before the King's Bench with Captain Knowles, who declares, Charles Stuart, a colonial from America, delivered his slave Somerset to be sold in Jamaica. Lord Mansfield released Somerset pending a hearing, suggesting he be set free. But West Indian planters wanted a decision upholding slavery in Britain to keep prices stable in the commodities market. Lord Mansfield cautions them. If they think the question of great commercial concern is the only method of settling the point in the future, they should prepare an application to Parliament. But Parliament, content to let the matter rest at the King's Bench, refused the merchants a hearing. On June 22nd, 1772, while the clerk called the case of James Somerset, a Negro on habeas corpus, Lord Mansfield, bewigged, the Chief Justice of the oldest and highest court in England, mounted the bench to deliver his judgment. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political. It's so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences therefore may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. Stuart felt betrayed and publicly humiliated. Why? Almost 200 years pass, and the matter at the heart of that matter resurfaces in a provocative letter James Baldwin wrote in 1963 to his brother's son James. The crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen is that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed, one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death, but it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. It was a question of innocence, after all. From the common sense view of the presumption of innocence, Stuart's generosity of spirit saw the best, not the worst, in a 9-year-old personable African stranger. But Stuart could not imagine the cloth of English common law clothing his personal property, and instead imagined himself innocent, a victim, betrayed and publicly humiliated by his property. Stuart, not unlike the Americans 2 centuries later, wallows in a delusion of innocence. Think 9/11 and weapons of mass destruction. In April 1952, President Harry Truman declared that an impending steel strike would immediately jeopardize and impair our national defense, and ordered the Secretary of Commerce to take possession of all or such of the plants, facilities, and other property of the steel companies as he may deem necessary in the interest of national defense. The steel seizure case which followed culminated in an injunction prohibiting the Secretary from obeying the President's order. 6 justices explained their reasons separately for deciding the order was unconstitutional. But the opinion of Justice Robert H. Jackson has most clearly withstood subsequent legal scrutiny. The actual art of governing under our Constitution does not and cannot conform to judicial definitions of the power of any of its branches based on isolated clauses or even single articles torn from context. While the Constitution diffuses power the better to secure liberty, it also contemplates that practice will integrate the dispersed powers into a workable government. James Madison rises to speak at the 1787 Constitutional Convention. It seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interests lay not between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination. Not having any understanding or experience how to do so, the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention of 1787 entered into a state of delusion. They contemplated the actual art of governing when the institution of slavery and its consequences formed the line of discrimination. They actually constructed a written constitution that diffused power the better to secure slavery, their only path into a workable government, the better to secure liberty. The Somerset Clause, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor is due. Lawrence Tribe, in his penetrating work, The Invisible Constitution, writes, "At the very same time that the Constitution's tangible and self-contained writtenness appears central to its grip on our imaginations, what holds us in its grip, what we treat as its meaning, cannot be found in the written text alone, but resides only in much that one cannot perceive from reading it." Reading Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, one does not see Somerset, a category of constitutional property. Yet, for 70 years, Somerset lay there, invisible, hidden like a riptide, while constitutional law and the delusion of white supremacy clashed against common law and the aspirations of we the people, until inevitably one such we the people, Dred Scott, the central character in the 1857 decision by Roger B. Taney, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was transformed into a constitutional riptide, a weapon of mass destruction. Herman Bondi, in Relativity and Common Sense, remarks that a wiser man is needed to ask the right question than to answer it. One of the oldest problems is the question of motion. This has puzzled people for many centuries. Why do things move as they do? What makes them move? Bondi identifies Newton's great insight into this question, his principle of relativity, as we might call it, the idea that velocity does not matter. In other words, merely changing the question from what causes the velocity of the Earth to what causes the acceleration of the Earth immediately leads one from chasing a hare to seeing the sun. Lawrence Tribe would like to lead us all from chasing a constitutional hare to seeing a constitutional sun, and leans on us all to ask a different kind of constitutional question. I'm convinced that the invisible Constitution is at the center of the Constitution's meaning and its inestimable value. My hope is to nudge the nation's constitutional conversation away from debates over what the Constitution says and whether various constitutional claims are properly rooted in its written text, and towards debates over what the Constitution does. Put otherwise, I hope to shift the discussion from whether various constitutional claims are properly rooted within the Constitution's written text to whether claims made in its name rightly describe the content, both written and unwritten, of our fundamental law. If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. The 1,000 delegates in Springfield, Illinois, at the 1858 Republican State Convention thought Lincoln's words injudicious, to say the least. Sentences that dug that deep would surely defeat their Senate nominee, and so they did. Then 5 years later at Gettysburg, digging deeper still, Lincoln spun his invisible constitutional gyroscope to lift up the nation's We the People vector, to elevate in the middle of the nation's constitutional property war the idea that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, let alone, one might add, from constitutional America. The political, social, economic, and cultural boundary between Stuart and Somerset, invisible in our Constitution as a boundary separating constitutional people from constitutional property, had, even before the nation was formed, acquired a geography. Boundaries of all kinds, imperial frontiers, colonial borders, property limits, were inseparable from the development of colonial America. In 1732, the heirs of William Penn got the Court of Chancery in London to shift the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to a boundary exactly 15 miles south of Philadelphia, and together with the Earl of Baltimore's family, who owned Maryland, shared the enormous course of having a definite boundary run by two British astronomers. To run an arc a dozen miles along a great circle on the circumference of the Earth took a week of stargazing at each end point and the use of the finest scientific instruments in the British Empire. After more than 2 years and 230 miles, their star-derived line reached another, older boundary high in the Appalachians, the Catawba Warpath, which marked the limit of the influence of the Six Nations, who had guaranteed their safety, and the beginning of the Delaware and Shawnee Territory. On October 9, 1767, 2 years before Somerset tested presumptions about his own safety, their diary noted that their Six Nation Guards would not proceed one step further westward, and so on a bluff overlooking the Monongahela River, a mound 5 feet high marks a boundary, a metaphor, a witness to a nation's presumption of innocence and positive law, the Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon boundary, the Mason-Dixon line, the nation's line of discrimination. The question is simply this: can a Negro, whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves, become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen, one of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States in the cases specified in the Constitution. It's 1858, almost 3/4 of a century after the Constitution established a workable government to secure slavery, the better to secure liberty, and Chief Justice Taney addresses the exercise we have before us today. That is, the effort that we are taking to nudge the nation's constitutional conversation away from debates over what the Constitution says and whether various constitutional claims are properly rooted in its written text, and towards debate over what the Constitution does. Chief Justice Taney was asking and answering a question about who the Constitution forbid and or required and or permitted to be members of its we the people class. The words people of the United States and citizens are synonymous terms and mean the same thing. They both describe the political body who, according to our Republican institutions, form the sovereignty and who hold the power and conduct the government through their representatives. They are what we familiarly call the sovereign people, and every citizen is one of this people and a constituent member of this sovereignty. The question before us is whether the class of persons described in the plea and abatement compose a portion of this people and are constituent members of this sovereignty. We think they are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. On the contrary, they were at the time considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race, and whether emancipated or not, yet remained subject to their authority and had no rights or privileges but such as those who held the power in the government might choose to grant them. No state can, by any act or law of its own, passed since the adoption of the Constitution, introduce a new member into the political community created by the Constitution of the United States. It cannot make him a member of this community by making him a member of its own. It is true, every person and every class and description of persons who were at the time of the adoption of the Constitution recognized as citizens in the several states became also citizens of this new political body, but none other. It was formed by them and for them and their posterity, but for no one else. It becomes necessary, therefore, to determine who were the citizens of the several states when the Constitution was adopted. In the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times, and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. Chief Justice Cheney reminds us that constitutional personhood is a dignitary status owed to all members of a political community, and that the 1787 Constitution dignified white men primarily as worthy of such status. It was an idea with long legs. When the war broke out in 1860, the South produced battle-ready cannon at the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, a vast industrial enterprise driven by 450 slaves and nearly as many free laborers. However, 4 years later, at the Battle of Mobile Bay, the CSS Tennessee withstood the barrage of 17 Union vessels without a single shot penetrating her hull, put together with iron from Bibb County, Alabama. In Slavery by Another Name, Douglas Blackman documents that though slavery was finished with those that didn't die, not all those that didn't were quite finished with it. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottonham was found guilty and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor. Unable to pay the array of fees, Cottonham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. The next day, under a standing arrangement between the county and U.S. Steel, Cottonham was sold, and the sheriff turned him over to Tennessee Coal and Iron, a subsidiary of U.S. Steel, for the duration of his sentence. The company gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottonham's fine and fees and sent him to the Pratt mines on the edge of Birmingham. Green Cottonham toiled under the lash with 1,000 other black men in slope number 12. Slaves in all but name. Almost 60 of the men died of disease, accidents, or homicide before the year was over. Green Cottonham was dead from disease after 5 months. Circular 3591 to all United States attorneys regarding involuntary servitude, slavery, and peonage. Issued by U.S. Attorney Biddle, December 12, 1941. A survey of the department files on alleged peonage violations discloses numerous instances of prosecution declined by United States attorneys, the chief reason stated as being the absence of the element of debt. To assure emphasis upon the issue of involuntary servitude and slavery, and considering these cases on the one hand, and to minimize the necessity of relying upon the element of debt to fix jurisdiction on the other, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been requested to change the title on its reports from peonage to read involuntary servitude and slavery. Henceforth, peonage will be considered as secondary to involuntary servitude and slavery investigations. What was going on? December 7th, 1941, the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt now needed black men to serve in the Army. And so he instructed his Attorney General to put an end to the practice of slavery. Legal slavery in the United States officially ended with Circular 3591, December 12, 1941. Black men scoured the attics and basements of courthouses, old county jails, storage sheds, and local historical societies to uncover a vast record of original documents and personal narratives, hundreds of thousands of pages of public documents attesting to the arrests, subsequent sale, and delivery of tens of thousands of Afro-Americans into mines, lumber camps, quarries, farms, and factories, detailing a forced labor system of monotonous enormity, abruptly ended by World War II, and the drumbeat of Japanese intelligence broadcasting to Negro soldiers trucking on the Burma Road. On December 7, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant argued for a constitutional amendment to establish public schools for the freed slaves in his 7th annual message to the United States Congress. As the primary step, therefore, to our advancement in all that has marked our progress in the past century, I suggest for your earnest consideration and most earnestly recommend it that a constitutional amendment be submitted to the legislatures of the several states for ratification, making it the duty of each of the several states to establish and forever maintain free public schools adequate to the education of all the children in the rudimentary branches within their respective limits, irrespective of sex, color, birthplace, or religions. Peter Berkowitz of the Hoover Institute at Stanford has this to say about our Constitution. By design, the American Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is a liberal constitution, one whose first purpose is to protect freedom by establishing authoritative limits, by proclaiming within the backing of the coercive power of the state what is forbidden, what is permitted, what is required. It creates background conditions for and sets a tone that reverberates throughout all spheres of our lives. Goodwin Liu, a member of the California Supreme Court, contrasts the adjudicated with the legislative constitution. The latter, he argues, is not narrow and legal, but rather dynamic and aspirational and infused with national values and commitments. Liu builds an argument for quality public school education as a constitutional right to be legislated from the citizenship rather than the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Liu argues that these opening words of the 14th Amendment, the guarantee of national citizenship, authorizes and obligates Congress to ensure a meaningful floor of educational opportunity throughout the nation. That together with Section 5, it obligates the national government to secure the full membership, effective participation, and equal dignity of all citizens in the national community. There may be very well the adjudicated and the legislative constitution, but for the SNCC insurgents in the 1960s Mississippi theater of the Civil Rights Movement, there was also the lived Constitution. A constitutional people cannot live by legislation alone. Constitutional democracy requires earned insurgencies. The sit-in students had to earn the platforms to put their issues on the national table. They had to summon their human dignity in the midst of psychological contempt and physical brutality. Weathered black sharecroppers brought forth courage in the face of economic deprivation and deadly physical assaults. Mississippi SNCC field secretaries had also to earn their insurgencies first and foremost. They had to earn the respect and trust of black farmers and sharecroppers to get them to risk their livelihoods, if not their lives. The idea was simple: get back up every time we got knocked down. We had also to earn the respect of the Justice Department civil rights lawyers. Thanks to the 1957 Civil Rights Act, when Mississippi locked us up working on voter registration, the feds would set us free. But nothing required the feds to turn that jailhouse key. We operated in a zone of constitutional permissiveness. From the constitutional point of view, nothing was forbidden. Nothing was required. Everything was a go. SNCC was permitted to conduct insurgent voter registration, to carry illiterates to register to vote. Terrorists were permitted to gun us down. Mississippi was permitted to lock us up. The Justice Department was permitted to set us free. On May 16, 1968, 400 students at Edgewood High School in San Antonio held a walkout and demonstration and marched to the district administration office. 90% of the students in the Edgewood district were of Mexican origin. Among the students' grievances were insufficient supplies and the lack of qualified teachers. The walkout induced parents to form the Edgewood District Concerned Parents Association, which sought to address the problems in the schools. The group, Alberta Snid, Demetrio Rodriguez, and other parents, mostly mothers. On July 10, 1968, Rodriguez and 7 other Edgewood parents filed on behalf of Texas school children who were poor or resided in school districts with low property tax bases. They sued for equity in school funding, but the Supreme Court ruled that there was no substantive federal right to a public school education. Justice Lewis Powell's majority opinion held that education was not a fundamental right, since it was guaranteed neither explicitly nor implicitly in the Constitution. We are a nation that, to its credit, has expanded the reach of its We the People class to include the freed slaves and women, but has done so with great pain and in units of time that span 3/4 of a century. We are celebrating the 50th anniversaries of events that took place in the 1960s, and therefore are 2/3 of the way into our third such 3/4 of a century. The first roughly from 1787 to the Civil War in the 1860s, and then the second roughly from 1875 to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The expansion has not been smooth. We have lurched forward when anti-slavery movements of the 19th century, women's rights and labor movements of the first half of the 20th century, civil rights, anti-war, and women's rights movements of the 1960s, and subsequent gay rights and immigrant rights all occupied the nation's We the People space. But we lurch backward when the We the People lose their footing. In the 18th century, we laid our Constitution down with the concept of a constitutional person thick enough to obligate the nation to track down constitutional property, insurgent runaway slaves, to be captured, shackled, and shipped back to constitutional people. In the 21st century, we must pick up our Constitution with the concept of a constitutional person as the dignity status owed as a fundamental right to all members of our political community. We posit that that status includes, at a minimum, the rights to literacy and a quality public school education, economic autonomy, family and cultural integrity, public accommodation, and political participation. Who, we may ask, is this we? The answer is to be found in the Constitution itself. We the people is an inescapable theoretical term in the preamble of our Constitution. The Constitution could not begin we the President, or we the Congress, or we the Supreme Court. Reflect that the preamble locates itself as a force not among the citizens of the United States, but simply without pretension among its people. How could it have done otherwise? There was no nation under which people could be citizens yet. No, we the people lies there, biding its time, waiting its resurgence. Say it after me again and feel its force. We the people of the United States.
We the people of the United States.
In order to form a more perfect union.
In order to form a more perfect union.
Establish justice.
Establish justice.
Provide for the common defense.
Provide for the common defense.
Promote the general welfare.
Promote the general welfare.
And secure the blessings of liberty.
And secure the blessings of liberty.
For ourselves. And our posterity.
And our posterity.
Do ordain and establish.
Do ordain and establish.
This Constitution.
This Constitution.
For the United States of America.
For the United States of America.
The presumption of innocence is not just a legal concept. In common sense terms, it depends on that generosity of spirit which seeks the best, not the worst, in the stranger. Thank you. Anybody want to ask a question? Or somebody want to say something? This is the we the people part of this.
I am honored to be in your presence, but I would say that it's easy to use that phrase, we the people, but the actual framers of the Constitution were really we the white landed gentry males. How would you respond to that?
Yes. So I think it's to the nation's credit that across the last couple of centuries, it has lurched back and forth, but continued to expand the reach of the we the people. So whatever you want to say about the country and how it has behaved, it has, by hook or by crook, managed to expand the reach of we the people. And here's my point, which is that nobody can stop us from actually owning we the people. Supreme Court can't do it, President can't do it, FBI can't do it. So we have to ask ourselves, why aren't we acting like a we the people?
What about corporations? Where that history came from?
Yes.
We need the corporations.
We the corporation. So what are we the people going to do about the Supreme Court decision that said we the corporation should run this country? So we have to ask ourselves, who are we? What do we want to become? what are we going to do about it? Right? There's not going to be anything done about it unless some we the people force arises. It clearly is not going to come from the leadership class, the elites who all have their children in private schools. Right? It's not going to come, right, unless we the people decide to do something. Right? So that's my question. Right? That's my issue. And the forces that have moved the country towards narrowing the gap between what it preaches and what it practices have been the we the people forces, right? And they've managed to figure out. And it isn't easy, right? In other words, it's hard to gather together and to agree on what the action should be. Webb Owens was the treasurer of the NACP in Macomb, Mississippi in 1961, and he kept the money in his back pocket. He couldn't put it in a bank, and people trusted him, and he took me around gathering $5 and $10 from people to get started. But every day he asked me the same, or told me the same thing. He would say, well, Bob, I'm in the NACP, I'm in SNCC, I'm in CORE, I'm in SCLC, I'm in anything that's going to get this monkey off my back. Now, what he was telling me was that there needed to be a consensus among we the people about what we were working on, that we needn't be distracted because we were in this or that organization. We needed to have an agreement about what we were doing and how we were doing it. So we need that around big ticket issues that face us in this country. We need that around the issue of public school education, right? The sharecroppers we worked with in the Mississippi Delta were the serfs of the industrial age of the 21st century. They couldn't access the economic arrangements. We are growing serfs in all kinds of places all over this country. The serfs of the information age. All the kids who are leaving with 8th grade, level education from high school, graduating with the equivalent of an 8th grade, they're bound for serfdom if they don't have parents who can support them. So what are we doing about it? Right? What? Because it's not going to come from either the political parties. It's not going to come from the leadership class that has all their children in the private schools. Right? But then we need to, are we a people that can have an open and honest conversation about whether we should elevate public school education to the level of the Constitution of the country? Can we even have a conversation about that? Are we a people who can do that? Right? Can we face all the different ways in which we have bones to pick with each other?
Everybody says that America is a land of laws, land of law, especially the politicians, right? That's how we live. But I surely would like to see that America is a land of justice. Because there's tons of laws that have criminals, people of color in prisons that don't belong there. These are laws that are putting them there, right? But justice says they shouldn't be there. And I wish our country would focus on the difference, because it's all one-sided or ignorant on one side, saying that these laws dominate our lives, and that's how we should live. We've got to focus a little bit, well, a lot, on justice. Would you say you got mad?
So, you have to think that there were no African Americans in jail under slavery. None. They were a workforce and they were employed. And then after slavery, we have Doug Blackman's testimony. Blackman himself is really interesting. You should look him up. He was born in 1964 in Leland, Mississippi, in the Mississippi Delta. His parents were white. He hit the first grade in 1970 when Mississippi was forced to integrate its schools. And his parents thought, well, it's the law of the land, and they didn't have the money to send him to the private academies. So he went to school with black kids. When he hit the 7th grade, he decided to enter into an essay contest. And for some reason, which he's not quite sure of today, he decided to write about Strike City. So Strike City was near Leland, and it happened in 1965 during the movement, and plantation workers walked off their plantation and set up something they called Strike City. So he won that, and then in the 8th grade, his parents and his teachers asked him if he wouldn't give his talk to the Rotary Club. And so he did, and got the shock of his life, because it turned out that one of the night riders who had actually murdered one of the people, the black people in Strike City, was in the audience. He was still alive. Blackman thought he was writing about ancient history, and he accosted him. He went on to school, college, and became a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, based in Atlanta. He had been to the Berlin Wall and all over. And he asked himself a question. He said, what if we took a look at American corporations vis-a-vis how they treated black people in the same way as we have looked at German corporations vis-a-vis how they treated Jewish people? And so he began his investigation and wrote an article that appeared on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And he was inundated with letters from all over the country, people telling him about their relatives who had been in this condition. And so he then made his investigations. So my point regarding your question is that you can think for the first 75 years of these 3-quarter intervals that I talked about, black men were valued as work and were never put in jail. Then for the next 75 years, black men, as the Attorney General Biddle said in his circular, were arrested for vagrancy and peonage and actually subject to involuntary servitude and a form of slavery by the tens and hundreds of thousands. And so they did not fill the jails. They were still working. Now here we are after the Civil Rights Movement, and there is no work for black men or for anybody who doesn't have the level of education that's required in the information age and the knowledge economy. So they are in jail. Right? And that is not going to stop, right? But that's been the country's way of handling black men. Slaves, indentured servitudes, servants, and then jailbait.
following that argument, then would you say that what we've done is simply enslaved other people in other parts of the world, and now we're just sitting here waiting to reap the reaps of their labors? In other words, all we're doing is we're just moving slavery around the world now that it's a global economy.
So how do we stop that?
So that's a great question, and I invite we the people to discuss it. Somebody want to talk about that question? So he's internationalizing this discussion. What do you think about the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the planet?
You made a very brief reference to 9/11, and I'm not sure I got the gist right, but I want to say this. When JFK was assassinated, Malcolm X made a statement about chickens coming home to roost. And when 9/11 happened, I felt the same way.
Right. The reference to 9/11 and the weapons of mass destruction was a reference to our kind of insistence on innocence, right? This is the question that Stewart, I think, was facing. He thought himself innocent, right? So to go to war with Iraq, we had to be innocent. So we manufactured something called weapons of mass destruction. So this is a theme throughout our history. The idea that, I mean, one of our problems is we really have not yet been able to have a real story of our history. Part of the problem, as Taylor Branch puts it, the story of the history of this country has to be entered through the gate of race. And so we're reluctant to do that. We haven't been. So in some senses, we're a young country. So Iraq people have been there for 5,000 years. You know, we got a couple hundred years under our belt. So we're a young country. The question is, we're young and powerful, dangerous combination. And so the question is how we need to mature. We need to mature quickly. We don't have a lot of push to mature, right? To have these conversations like you're raising, right?
Not to belittle the efforts of Martin Luther King and civil rights activists and, the people, but there is a conspiracy theory that says that the reason why the civil rights movement was so successful was because the government wanted to improve its self-image. Just how you said that Roosevelt, the reason why he wanted to end slavery was because he wanted to have more soldiers. So I want to know what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. So these little movements we have take place on the larger historical currents. So the large historical current was the movement for independence by what people call colonial nations or third world nations all over the planet, which was spurred by World War II, because many of those peoples were sucked up to be involved in World War II, and World War II raised the issue of the dignity of just ordinary people. And so after the war, the battle between the Soviet Union and the United States, where they were battling for who was going to have influence in colonial peoples around the planet, was raging. And so our little struggle here, we were an internal colonial people. And so our little struggle here was played out against that background. NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group at Howard University, did its sit-ins on Route 40 because that was the route that the ambassadors to the United Nations from the African countries took as they shuttled back and forth between the United Nations and their embassies in Washington. And there was no place along that route where they could eat, you know. So it was a way to embarrass this country and get some pressure from the federal government, right? So absolutely. The struggle we have now is taking place against this planet-wide transition from the industrial technologies of the 19th and 20th century to the information age technologies. And it's for that reason that algebra is available as an organizing tool, because the information age technologies bring quantitative literacy on the table in the same way as industrial technologies made reading and writing a literacy that you needed to access those economic arrangements. So all of these little movements we have take place against much larger backgrounds over which we have no control.
You look tired.
I'm okay.
We appreciate everything that you've done for us today. You know, like you came and you talked about the importance of our youth being able to gain the knowledge that they need to be able to step up into the higher learning institutions that our country provides. But basically, in the end, doesn't it amount to the fact that the way we're going to all find our way forward is that we must all learn that we're all the same, regardless of our race, of our color, of our sex, of our whatever. We're all God's children, and we should all learn to help each other along the way. And if that means tearing down institutions that hold us back, then we should do that.
Yes, so the question of what we should do is, you know, how you get the we in that what we should do to agree on what we should do. I would add to being God's children, being constitutional people. I think, you know, this country is nothing if it's not a constitutional democracy. And so the question is, and the idea of a constitutional person is kind of floating up there, right? It's not as concrete as other ideas, but we can make it mean something. Certainly, the idea of being a citizen of this country means something when you're, you know, asked to go fight abroad. You don't go fight as a citizen of Colorado, right? So the idea of being a national citizen means something. I think the young people here, right? The people who are between 10 and 40, 30 years from now, you will be between 40 and 70. And you will be running this country, for better or worse, right? And so, why not think now about how you can get yourselves together, about how you would like to run the country when you take it over, And one thing that you need to think about is that while we have expanded the reach of we the people to various categories of adults, we have not expanded it to young people. Young people are not constitutional people in this country, right? You have no constitutional right to your education, right? In fact, you have no constitutional rights. So why not take on that struggle and think about it? Thanks, everybody. A great
Thanks so
audience.
much. There's some information about activities this summer you might be interested in, but thanks for coming out, and thanks again, Bob Mosley. Thank you.